All right, welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at my current Homelab setup as of about June 2024. So let's jump in. And if you're new here, hi and welcome. This is Synology Tech, and we make a bunch of videos covering all kinds of tech topics from home labs to hardware to coding and even some current events. So if you like the content, go ahead and hit the sub button, like, and leave a comment to let me know what else you'd like to see. So what we'll do is we'll go through each piece of hardware in my home lab as well as the software running in on it. And as always, a home lab is always a work in progress. And I pretty quickly built my home lab going from a simple Amplify setup with 2 devices and a mesh network and a firewall to a pretty significant setup with like a rack and a bunch of different machines, etc. The actual rack itself is a good place to start. It's a simple StarTech. I think it's a 9U rack. I'll have to check on that. And it's basically, as you can see, sitting on a shelf in my office closet. And it's actually sitting sideways because that's how it happens to fit on the shelf. And the network jacks to my Unify cameras are on the wall, and it was just easier to kind of line it up that way so the wires go straight from the back of the machines right out the wall and over to those cameras. And this being an outside wall, it was an optimal place to put the rack. And yes, I know the wires are a total mess. I've never been great at cleaning up wires, so they'll probably stay like that for a long time. Anyway, the backbone of the network is a Unify Dream Machine Pro SE. It is connected to a Unify 24 PoE switch. The Dream Machine is running Unify Protect, as I mentioned, and has a number of Unify cameras attached to it. And the Unify Dream Machine Pro has additional storage in the form of a Western Digital purple drive for the video files. So this was my first Unify setup, and I didn't know how far down the HomeLab path I would go, so I didn't go down the route of getting 10 gigabit networking. I do have a couple terabytes of data sitting around, but I don't move them around that much. They pretty much just sit on my Synology and don't get access to a whole lot, so they're pretty much at rest. So I figured 1 gigabit would do for now, and maybe I'll upgrade in the future for fun or if I need the speed. And realistically, between $379 for the switch, $499 for the Dream Machine, not to mention the cameras, at probably $100 each, some network access points, and a few other things, I thought I'd given Ubiquiti enough money to get started. And speaking of network access points, let's talk for a minute about my home networking setup. For Wi-Fi coverage, I am using 2 Unify U6 access points. They are called mesh access points, but we'll get back to that, and 1 U6 Pro. Now the U6 Pro it's designed as a ceiling mount, but it's simply sitting on a coffee table in one of the rooms in the house. And I wanted a third U6 mesh, but none were available. So I just grabbed the U6 Pro and threw it on a tabletop, and it works perfectly. I've had no issues with coverage or anything else. And as a side note, the U6 mesh access points get absurdly hot, especially at the base. I don't know why. It's something I should look into and see if that's normal, but if you grab one, you're certainly in for a surprise on that. Now, even with the 3 Wi-Fi access points, most devices in the house are connected leveraging the in-wall coax and MoCA devices. And so if you aren't familiar with MoCA, it allows you to leverage coax cables for Ethernet access. And in my experience, it's really been fantastic. I was skeptical at first, having used things like power line networking in the past, which was terrible, but MoCA really has been great. And I consistently see speeds close to the advertised like max 1 gigabit of my home network. So I'm pleasantly surprised. Now, all of my Wi-Fi access points leverage MoCA for backhaul. So even though I have U6 quote unquote mesh access points, I'm actually not doing any mesh networking at all, which is super nice. Also, there are a couple places in the house where I have a MoCA device connected to a Unify Flex mini switch, just because a couple of devices in the room need internet access as well. But that's pretty much what my network configuration looks like. So next up in my HomeLab setup is the NAS, which is the Synology RS822 Plus. It currently has 2 Seagate Iron Wolf Pro 18 terabyte drives. Just needed 2 drives to start, and so I have 2 spare bays ready for expansion. And the Synology really is the storage backbone of the house, with most devices in the house connected to it, most user devices like PCs, etc., and are interacting with it through Synology Drive. Now, I've done an entire separate video on how I use Synology at home, which goes into more depth on this. Now, I try to keep the Synology relatively clean, and it only runs a couple of servers like a Git server and Plex. So there, from a Homelab perspective, there's not much other software running on the Synology. Now, moving down the rack, below the Synology is really the virtual machine playground. And this is the Dell 370XD server. It has 2 Xeon CPUs with a total of 56 cores, 256 gigabytes of RAM, and 10 enterprise class drives for a total of about 10 terabytes of storage, running in a RAID 5 configuration. Now, I picked this up on eBay for just over $600. And it has been a great tool for experimenting with different software and network configurations. Interestingly enough, I wasn't planning on buying a used server off of eBay. And I think this particular one came out of an AT&T data center based on the tag on it. But remember, I paid like $600 for it. At one point in time, I had some old PCs sitting around, which you'll hear about in a second. And they have like 8 gigabytes and 16 gigabytes of RAM respectively on them. And I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna throw some additional memory in these. And I went, and like the new memory was not cheap. I think on Amazon I was looking at spending $400 on memory. Then I went to eBay and ended up going down the rabbit hole of used servers. And I was like, well, for $600 I can get an entire server with 256 gigabytes of RAM and all this other goodness to play with. So that was it's definitely been a worthwhile investment. And if you're looking for a VM playground, I highly recommend checking out the used server market. As I said, for similar prices, you could go down the mini PC route, but why bother with that when you could get something large, hot, and loud for the same price? I mean, it's a bargain. But joking aside, I found playing with the data center class hardware a great learning experience in itself. Just kind of getting that box, opening it up, seeing how they're built inside, seeing how their motherboards are laid out, the fans, everything else. If you're used to building PCs, it's completely different, and it's fun to kind of take it apart and learn about it, even if that comes at the cost of a slightly higher power bill and a whole lot of questions from the other members of your household when the fans spin up. Now, the 370XD has I think they're redundant 1,000 watt power supplies, so I intentionally don't run any mission critical, household critical software on it, because I unplug it when it's not in use. And I literally unplug the cords from the power supplies in the back when I'm not using it, both of them. And the reason is this machine has iDRAC running on it, which basically means it has another mini computer that is always running. And so that iDRAC allows you to turn the machine on and off, change essentially BIOS level configuration, etc., even when the machine is off. Has a separate network connection and everything. When you leave the machine plugged in, iDRAC is always up and running. And so I have no idea what the power usage is when it's just sitting around, but I'm guessing it's not small, and I'd be willing to bet it's quite a bit more than even something like a Raspberry Pi. So when I'm not using it, I just power it down and unplug it. So when it is running, I have a VM running redundant instances of services like Pi-hole and another Git server. But again, these services don't need to be up all the time, so I turn them off so I can keep electricity costs down. The server also runs Portainer and my Guacamole services for remote access when I need that. Next up in the Homelab, I have 2 TrueNAS hosts. These are old PCs, which I referenced above, that I had sitting around the house. They were literally just sitting in a cabinet in the garage. And respectively, they have like a Core i5 6600K with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And the other one has a Core i5, 3330 with 8 gigabytes of RAM. And both of these PCs have a bunch of consumer grade drives in them, providing an extra 24 terabytes of storage. And so rather than just leave them in the garage collecting dust, what I decided to do is I took them out, I threw TrueNAS on each of them, and now I have extra space to play with if needed. One of the TrueNAS machines is running a container with Homar from my dashboard. It has draw.io in another container, and it does have an Ubuntu VM, which is running my primary Pi-hole instance for the house. And this TrueNAS instance is up all the time. And then finally, while there are many PCs around the house, laptops, iPads, etc., my gaming PC is used for a fair amount of tinkering as well. It's an i9-9900KS with 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 3090 Ti graphics card, and it dual boots both Linux and Windows, with Linux being my daily driver these days. So that's the rundown on my Homelab. And like I said, 6 months ago, I was just sitting with 2 Amplify devices, Firewalla, and the gaming PC I just referenced. It was pretty simple. It's come a long way in kind of building it out, changing all the networking in the household, and really starting to play with a bunch of different configurations. And of course, it's always evolving, and there's some things I'd like to do. So what's next? And I think the biggest opportunity in the current setup are the two TrueNAS machines I mentioned above. And again, these are running on old PCs in PC cases sitting on the floor. Unfortunately, TrueNAS no longer supports clustering, and it doesn't, ZFS, the file system underneath TrueNAS, doesn't support using mismatched drives in the pools. So what happens is when you throw a bunch of drives in a ZFS pool, you basically get a multiple of the smallest drive. So if you have a 2 terabyte, a 5, and a 5, you'll get like 6 terabytes of storage, and you'll end up losing a bunch. And the way I've addressed that in the two TrueNAS machines I have is to make a bunch of different pools and group drives which are relatively close in size. And so that's been fine, but I just end up with a bunch of pools. It's difficult to manage, and I don't have one giant pool of storage. So what I'd like to do over the next few months is figure out a way to take both of those machines and make one storage pool out of them. Now, I think Ceph might be the answer to this, and I've done other videos on Ceph, especially related to Proxmox. I'll either run a straight plain vanilla Ceph cluster with the machines, where I could just put all the drives into the cluster and let it manage the storage, or I might look at bringing the 370XD server into the mix, where I can make a Proxmox 3-node cluster, let Proxmox handle the Ceph cluster, and then expose that through probably, I think the way you do it is through a VM running on Proxmox. You could expose that storage cluster. But then I could take all those drives across all those machines and just expose a single storage pool. But that wraps it up. That was a quick look at my Homelab setup, the software that I'm running on it today, and future plans. Love to hear about yours. Drop any comments or questions below, and we'll see you next time.